many years ago, Aaron, when we were sitting at the Grove Inn in Huddersfield, I was talking to you about the body instrument combination as a site, as a location for uh, your interest in multi-vector parametricization and your approach to choreography. And we were discussing metaphors. I was particularly interested in the container at the time and how forces act upon that, and that can then be understood as spinning itself out as from the score linking straight through to the body. And it's a very apt discussion at the time. I felt, because you had written a few years earlier Pleat Sonata for the electric guitar with multiple effects, and it was prior but still relevant and pertinent to the lap steel solo in Record Form and Boundaries. But now you enter this work, this ensemble work, the Piano Concerto, as a body yourself. So you are present as a conductor. So I'm just wondering, in terms of your conception of your role as a conductor, are you, let's maybe start off, are you immersed within the body of the ensemble and another one of the many bodies that are involved in the performance, or are you a more conventional model, if you like, of the conductor that's sort of standing outside and directing the uber vision of all the performative bodies that are sitting behind an instrument?
That's a great question. So the rhythmic notation, the metrical notation for this is, honestly, it's the same as the two Richter quartets, and it's best to talk about my experience of conducting those. So the first one of those that I did, so just to to explain it fully, the idea is that any beat can be any speed, any duration, and there's this constant pushing and pulling of speeds, literally from one beat to the next. And the first time I conducted that, it was for a piece that wasn't intended to be conducted in its kind of original conception, and I was pulled in to conduct in the rehearsals initially, and that turned into conducting the gig. And from the moment, literally within the first system of doing that, I had this sudden realization, this is actually, this approach to meter and this approach to conducting is what I've been trying to do rhythmically in my work for literally decades at that point. And there was this sudden sort of flash about the link between movement, my movement, and gesture and shape that for me was really satisfying. And so what happens in reality in this metrical structure, where every beat can be a different speed, is that everything that I'm doing is always an upbeat. It always is setting up the next event, and it has to be, first of all, it has to be shaped in a way. There's no moment in conducting that where you kind of sit and you're marking time, or where something can kind of recede into the background, because you're always shifting the speed and duration of every single beat. But what that also means is that all of the events that happen inside of it have to be shaped and I don't know, stretched or compressed or whatever, based on the location of the next beat, which in my experience has meant that every single beat, every single bar, every single motion ends up being totally collaborative with the ensemble. So we are kind of deciding together. So I'm listening to material that fits inside of that beat, and we're placing the next beat together, listening back and forth between the players and my movements. So yeah, I mean, your question is exactly right, that it ends up kind of putting me in a space where those kinds of physical motions are helping to my physical motions are helping to drive the physical engagement and motions of the players in the ensemble at the same time, and we're kind of pushing and pulling with one another, which I really enjoy. And I guess the sort of stepping backwards, I've also had the experience in quite a lot of post I mean sort of late 20th, early 21st century repertoire, where the role of the conductor often doesn't have that direct relationship to movement or event or gesture, where you're setting some kind of grid or frame against which other things happen, and that happens in the kind of everything's in 4/4 at quarter equals 60 kind of notation in Ligeti or Xenakis or whatever. But then it also happens in like I haven't conducted any Fernie-Ho, but it also happens in Fernie-Ho, right, where you're not necessarily where you're controlling the container, but not necessarily having a direct link with the things that happen inside of that container. And so the thing that I really enjoy in these recent works of mine is that it feels like conducting often what happens in much more kind of traditional historical repertoire, like Brahms or whatever, where you have this really close connection between physical movement of the conductor and the kinds of gestural shapes that happen within the ensemble.
So I have the impression that when you're discussing Brian and other composers' works, it's a discussion about the composer in a certain way standing out in front of the ensemble as a guarantor of certainty, that enables the players who have worked, one would always assume, would have worked really, really hard to deliver their articulate their brilliance. The model that you're talking about with respect to you as the composer articulating the conductor, the reverse of that is you are also performative, perhaps have but you are sort of also got a relationship in controlling the passage of time, because in any one moment or any one set of events, you're creating the space for the next event. And that's really interesting. So you're in responding to whatever the energies or things that are at play in the moment, you're creating the basis, the reactive basis for the next thing to explode into being. And that to me is a really interesting.
I mean, that's so. I would shift it very slightly, which is that it's my experience has been that it's always that kind of shaping is still always collaborative with the players, and it kind of it depends on the circumstance. It depends on it depends on the material. But for example, in those two Richter quartets, and this is also the case in the Piano Concerto, there are almost always primary lines. They're kind of soloistic lines, and it's that line which helps drive the speed. And so it's kind of pointless for me to just put those beats wherever I think they should go, and have someone else try to speed up and slow down and catch up to fit the notated material in that space. Instead, it's that I really do feel like we're doing that together, that there's a kind of gestural shape that fits inside of a beat, and together, kind of back and forth, those sounds and those articulations are happening at a point where now we realign together on each new beat. So I'm not just even driving it or setting the frame, but listening and responding, and so there's push and pull. There's times when I'm trying to
okay, but in this sort of play of push and pull and being responsive, collaboratively in the moment. I think what's really interesting to me is that although you've written what is yet to come, you're
Mm.
it's this sense of creating the space of what is to come that I think is really quite. Um, I'm trying to think of other. It's not that. Yeah, I can't think of other sorts of musics in that quite have that in that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, it's like it takes some of the, really kind of basic principles of like rubato, like conducting rubato in whatever romantic music, but taking that and then
to quite extreme level, yeah,
exploding it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So where do you think this experience then will push your do you have, composing? Do you have any expectation of? Um,
Actually, yeah, I don't know, and in part that's because the next step will I think depend on whether or not this step worked. So I mean, the other pieces that have used this notation that have been conducted pieces have been small. They've been quartets, um, and so obviously much bigger instrumentation and a lot more in this piece that happens in these sort of large scale tutis, and I'm well, I mean, in a couple of weeks we'll find out how that works. I mean, it'll be a new set of strategies, even just sort of kind of physical vocabulary strategies. It's a much bigger ensemble, much more space on stage. The added kind of complexity of someone in a soloist role and trying to, I mean, that's one of the things I've been thinking through is the, well, kind of in the historical model of the concerto, the role of the ensemble is at least to some degree accompanimental, right? So the soloist has the ability to, all of that kind of pushing and pulling starts often with them, right? And setting a sense of tempo or speed or whatever. And so I think that for me that will become really interesting, of the relationship between Alex as a soloist and me as conductor, and then this ensemble material that also has lots of very highly soloistic things, and it'll yeah, that's for me, that's sort of the next step, is um how to upscale this strategy into larger formations, larger ensembles, and what happens in those larger contexts.
yeah, cool. And of course, one of the really fascinating things in the piano concerto is the instrument choices, which are really quite unique. You know,
I don't even remember where it came from, because you and I talked about it over quite a long period of time, because we started talking about this years ago. I mean, it would have
yeah,
been after the first performance of Self-Portrait Three Times Standing, I think, which would have been 5 years ago, something like that, 4 years ago.
look, I think
And
the Siemens application probably went in about 2018 or
yeah,
thereabouts.
or 19, yeah. And
Yeah,
but we'd already been talking about it for maybe a year by the time we put in that application. Like, it was already an idea, and we talked through various approaches to instrumentation. And I always had the idea of the low brass and winds. That was always somehow part of the instrumentation. And yeah, I don't really remember how it kind of expanded out, but
I remember
I'm
suggesting
not really sure what
nine.
to say about it, because I mean,
No,
it's a number of things. First of all, you've got the kind of strangeness of the low brass and winds as a kind of group, and then the your quartet, which I always kind of conceived as a quartet, has, so it's not only the lap steel guitar, which again, like you and I, when was the trip to Austin? 2017, 16?
17.
17.
17, I think. Yeah, I think it was 17. Yeah.
So and I still, in the back of my mind, have the thought of at some point doing a big pedal steel solo. And so
Cool.
this is also like a kind of a place to test out some of the things with the instrument. And it's, the kind of strangeness, like the utterly bizarre kind of medieval strangeness of the instrument's mechanisms. And
Yeah.
then the harp is almost entirely prepared. It's like 2/3 of the strings are prepared.
33,
Um,
I think.
plus
Yeah.
um, plus plus the electronics for the harp and the percussion, and then in the other trio, the recorder is also very strange, as part of this ensemble recorder, and the cello and bass are also quite often prepared using these little 3D printed plastic couplers
Oh, yeah.
and random like clips and various things.
Yeah. I remember, I think I was suggesting, Ryan, to you that we'd actually resolved the number of players and for the application that had gone into Siemens, and then we were looking at it, and I was just again thinking of people who were coming into the ensemble who were really quite special, and then Ryan got added in. It's kind of like as an afterthought at the very end. But yeah, I'm just thinking from what you're saying without going through the detective work of trailing through my emails. It's probably been a very long conversation going back from our trip in Austin, and then taking
Yeah,
in various events like being post rec and the quartet coming up, and so it's one of those where to next in the journey, long years long
yeah,
conversations we've had. Yeah.
yeah. As it happens that the addition of the recorder, the recorder ends up playing a really important role in the
Yeah,
piece.
it does. Yeah.
It like finishes the piece. Like the piano
Yeah,
concerto ends with a recorder solo.
that's right.